Have you wondered how the gospel writers got their information? This video, which is part 9 of a series, will make you familiar with some of the material found only in Luke's gospel, and how Luke may have received it from the witness of women. I'm Gene van der Zanden, author of Women of Passion, Mark's Passion, and Passion and Purpose, interesting historical novels about the people and events that shaped the early church. We'll cover a number of topics in this video: the latest scholarship on the origin of the Gospels, the material found only in Luke, the accounts that show how women related to Jesus and how Jesus related to women, how Luke identified the women who likely were his sources, and how our images of gospel scenes impact our interpretation. I've been able to travel to many of the early Christian sites in the Holy Land, Turkey, Greece, and Italy. Here I am on the Sea of Galilee. After retiring from full-time ministry, I looked for answers about the origins of the Gospels. Who were the writers? Where did they get their information? And who were their sources? Where did they get the eyewitness testimony? This slide gives the time frame for when the Gospels were put in writing. Most New Testament scholars today believe that Mark wrote first, and they've pinpointed the dates. Based on references within the text, they believe Mark wrote after the execution of St. Peter by the Romans in late 64 or early 65 AD, and before the destruction of Jerusalem by the forces of Titus in 70 AD. This starting point is almost universally adopted by Catholic, Orthodox, and mainline Protestant scholars today. Matthew and Luke wrote independently of each other during the 80s, and John added his gospel in the 90s. Mark was not an eyewitness, but he served at Peter's side for several years as his aide and interpreter. Later references say Mark began putting the gospel in writing in Rome when others urged him to do so. St. Peter was a talker. He preferred face-to-face communication. When Peter was arrested and held in the Mamertine prison, Mark began writing. But he probably finished the gospel somewhere else, away from the dangers of the persecutions of Nero. We know very little about the gospel writers. Mark was an aide and interpreter of Peter. That's where he got his information. Matthew may have been Matthew, Levi, the tax collectors. Scholars are divided on this. Some prefer the traditional view, while others see the gospel writer as a different Matthew. Luke was a physician who traveled with St. Paul for part of Paul's second missionary journey, and later, when Paul delivered the collection for the Jerusalem Christians. Many scholars think Luke also assisted Paul while he was imprisoned in Palestine and when he was shipped to Rome and kept there under house arrest. John the evangelist was a disciple who knew Jesus quite well. They were good friends. John calls himself the disciple Jesus loved. John definitely was an eyewitness. He wrote last, adding things the others did not include. So St. Luke was the gospel writer who drew from the widest array of sources. He traveled more than the others. He encountered more eyewitnesses who could tell him things about Jesus. He also realized that the gospel needed to be shaped for a Gentile audience, and that's what he set out to do. New Testament scholars have developed a model that explains why Matthew and Luke have more passages than Mark. A lot more. They believe that by the 80s AD there were two source documents in wide circulation in the Mediterranean world: the Gospel according to Mark and a written account of some of the sayings of Christ such as his many parables and teachings that are not present in Mark. This source of the sayings of Jesus, labeled Q on the chart, no longer exists, but is presumed to have existed because of the similarities of the sayings quoted in Matthew and Luke. Q is the first letter of the word source in German, and this label stuck. That's what scholars now call it. Matthew and Luke both drew upon Mark, copying much of his text, and they drew upon Q, adding the parables and teachings. Apparently, Mark chose to emphasize the deeds of Jesus more so than what Jesus said. Mark probably was aware of the Q source, but didn't copy much of it. But both Matthew and Luke wanted to compose more complete gospels that included the sayings like, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." So they transcribed the Gospel of Mark and also drew upon the sayings and any other material they could obtain to complete the versions of the Gospel. It's good to get to know this model. It explains a lot, and the evidence points to the likelihood that it conforms to what actually happened. A decade later, the evangelist John, who was an eyewitness to the events, particularly those around Jerusalem, wrote the fourth gospel and added things that the others didn't have. This slide shows the model in its more complete form. Matthew's gospel has passages that are not found in the others, like the story of the wise men who came to see Jesus in Bethlehem. Luke's gospel has even more passages found nowhere else in the New Testament, again because Luke traveled more widely and picked up more material. Here is a list of the passages found only in Luke. There are a lot of them. In the 1970s and 80s, the common explanation was that oral traditions were kept in the memory of communities until the gospel writers put them on paper. But some scholars had concern about the unreliability of oral transmission. And the theory gives little credit to eyewitness testimony. People in the first century were better at remembering than we are today, but plenty of eyewitnesses were available throughout most of the first century. The eyewitnesses offered the most reliable testimony. Do you know what Christian writings we have from the late first century, in addition to the New Testament? You may have heard of some late first century and early second century writings, such as the Didache, the Letter of Clement, the Story of the Shepherd of Hermas, and the Letters of Ignatius of Antioch. What other early documents have survived? Well, that was a trick question. No other early Christian writings from the first century have survived in their entirety. We do have parts of some of them, which were quoted in surviving 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century texts. Christian historians at that time liked to cut and paste sections from other writers into their histories. That's how we know that St. James went to Spain, and how St. Andrew went into Eastern Europe and the Black Sea, and how St. Peter spent his later years as the head of the church in Rome. And we know about people like Papias. Papias was bishop of Hierapolis, a city at the crossroads of travel routes in what today is Turkey. Papias was quoted in Eusebius's 4th century history of the church. He knew John the Evangelist, calling him John the Elder. This makes Papias' writing one of the most critical for understanding how Christians viewed the New Testament books as eyewitness testimony. Papias said, "The elder used to say, Mark became Peter's interpreter and wrote accurately all that he remembered. Matthew collected the oracles in the Hebrew languages, which, of course, was Greek in the Hebrew style. Papias also quoted Luke and alluded to the letters of Paul. He held up the Gospels on the basis of their apostolic or eyewitness credentials." The biblical books were written from a male patriarchal perspective, but occasionally they give us a woman's point of view. Examples are the Book of Ruth and the Song of Songs. In the Gospels, hearers are invited to react to Jesus by adopting a variety of perspectives. The disciples, the crowds, or someone Jesus had healed or challenged, some of them women. So the Gospels sometimes give voice to women. The evangelists knew that their audience would include both men and women. The texts are not entirely androcentric and sometimes are corrective of this. While all four evangelists were male, not all of their sources were male. Right in the first chapter of Luke, we see shifting perspectives. The narrator gives some background. Then we hear how Zechariah, in the conception of John the Baptist, there is a shift in verse 26 to the perspective of Elizabeth. Then to Mary, as the angel tells her, she will bear a son. Then to the visitation of Mary with Elizabeth and the birth of Jesus and John, all from a woman's perspective before shifting back to the men's. This seems intentional for Luke, as he follows a pattern widely used in the ancient world. In this chiastic pattern, the most important lines are placed in the middle. We see this same pattern in Mary's song of Magnificat, where she contemplates the reversal of status, which is about to take place with the birth of her son. Mary, the lowly servant, is lifted up by God, by God's mercy. God has scattered the proud. He has brought down the powerful and lifted up his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy. In a world where women were considered lowly and Israel was under the domination of Rome, any reference to the turning of pyramids upside down would be of interest to women. Now let's look at how St. Luke identified the women. In chapter 8, he reports that Jesus went through the cities and villages, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him, as well as some women who had been cured of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. Joanna, the wife of Herod's steward Chuza, and Susanna, and many others who provided for them out of their means. The men had previously been named, but here some women are named for the first time. The significant point is that these women and men were with him in discipleship. Luke says they also provided resources for the group out of their means. He does not say that the women only cooked the meals and washed the dishes. Jesus and his followers and their families had to live without their usual means of support, which the more affluent women apparently provided. These women were with Mary at the foot of the cross, and Luke names them again in describing how at daybreak on the first day of the week they took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone already rolled away, but when they entered, they did not find his body. Mark, Matthew, and John name different women and say there were others. All 4 name Mary Magdalene. She was well known. Mark also names Mary, the mother of James and Joses, and Salome. Mary and Salome were common names in Galilee. Matthew also names the mother of the sons of Zebedee. John names only Mary Magdalene, but has her speak as though there were others. Luke, though, gives emphasis to Joanna and Susanna. So what was so special to Luke about these women? Well, someone told him their names. He may have met with one or both of them. He was told that they ministered with Jesus as disciples. When you hear the word disciples, you have to be careful about the image you bring to mind. Is it a mixed group of men and women, or is it all testosterone? Some were well known among the early Christians, such as Mary Magdalene. Some were well off and could contribute financially, such as Joanna. Joanna was the wife of Herod's chief steward, which put him in the upper class, and most likely, since marriages were arranged by parents, she was also born in the upper class. Her choice to follow Jesus was not only a decision of faith, but also a conversion to be with the poor and the outcast, stepping down to be with those who Herod and the rich had marginalized. Joanna and Mary Magdalene and Susanna would have known the stories that carried a woman's perspective. Let's look again at the passages found only in Luke's Gospel. The women's stories include not only the infancy narratives about Jesus and John the Baptist, but also the raising of the widow's son at Nain, the sinful woman who bathed Jesus' feet with her tears, the names of the women who accompanied Jesus, the disagreement between Martha and Mary, the healing of the crippled woman on the Sabbath, the language Jesus used as he wept over Jerusalem, his encounter with the woman of Jerusalem on the way to Calvary, and that delightful parable of the persistent widow who harassed a judge to get what she wanted. That's a lot of stories about women. And if we color code the text, we see in blue a number of stories and parables about role reversal, which are of interest to women, and some stories about discipleship, which are in green. After Luke received this material, he named the women in his gospel. So, pick a story of a woman, like the raising of the widow's son at Nain, the story of Martha and Mary, or the sinful woman who bathed Jesus' feet with her tears. Get an image in your mind as you read the story. You can get a wide variety of images to select from on Google or Yahoo. Pick the one that moves you. Or pick a story of status reversal, like the parable of the publican and the sinner, or the places of honor at table. The image that you select will have a great deal to say about how you apply the scripture. Or pick a story of discipleship, like the sending of the 72, or the cost of discipleship, or the commissioning at Christ's ascension. Again, consider a variety of images before you focus in on it and how it implies to you. An important question for you is, how will you witness to what you have seen? So how can you follow up? It's a good idea to read all that you can about the early church. The more you know about it, the more meaningful the Gospels will be for you. So watch the other videos in this series. You'll learn a lot more. To find them, go to our Mark's Passion channel here on YouTube. You'll probably want to read Women of Passion, my historical novel about Mary Magdalene and Joanna, that explores their relationship with Jesus and what they did after he ascended into heaven. You also can get Passion and Purpose, my romantic historical novel about St. Peter in his later years, and Clement of Rome, who became the fourth pope. You might like Mark's Passion, my historical novel about the adventures of St. Mark, who first put the gospel in writing. It zeroes in on some of the most critical years of early Christianity. All of the historical people and events depicted in the books are factual, and it's an interesting way and a fun way to learn more. And I recommend that you go to my website, markspassion.com, and look at the free articles and information you'll find there. There are illustrations, maps, articles, and loads of links to other study sources. So get your copy of Women of Passion. Click on the Amazon.com link below this video and go order. And thanks for watching.